Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thanks those are streaming in online. I'm Margaret Scott. I'm with the New York Southeast Asia Network, and we're delighted to have everyone here today. And I want to have a big thanks to John Gershman, who's one of the founders of the network, and Emily Damali, who's our program coordinator, who's done a lot of work to put this together. And please, if you haven't joined or sign up for our newsletter. Today, I am delighted. We have the authors of these two books. One is The Milk Tea Alliance by Jeffrey Wasserstrom, who's sitting right here, and the other is Bangkok After Dark with a very interesting subtitle by Benjamin Tausig, who's sitting right next to me. And then we have a surprise guest, whom I will get to in 1 second. But first, I just want to do a couple of brief intros on Jeffrey and Benjamin. Jeffrey is a distinguished professor of history at UC Irvine and has been focused on China for a lot of his career and done a lot on social movements and Chinese history. But he's lately expanded his gaze. And first he did a very interesting book called The Vigil in Hong Kong, and that got him interested in Southeast Asia. And that has led to his latest book, which is The Milk Tea Alliance, which looks at Hong Kong, Myanmar, and Burma, and Thailand, sorry. And one of the subjects of his book, I'm gonna skip and then go back to Benjamin, of the top chapter on Thailand is a Thai activist who has translated everything from Isaiah Berlin to Hannah Arendt to Timothy Snyder to Liu Xiaobo into Thai. He's quite the activist. He was very involved in student politics for a long time. His name is Nedwit, and he's sitting right here. He's our surprise guest. He's at the Harvard Divinity School right now, and he will join the conversation after the two presentations by Jeffrey and Benjamin. The next up is Benjamin, and I have to say, I absolutely love this book. Benjamin, it's Bangkok After Dark. It's about Maurice Rocco, who's on the cover, African-American Black jazz pianist who plays standing up. And Benjamin uses his story in a beautifully poetic and deeply researched way to look at transnational nightlife and the makings of Cold War intimacies in looking at what Benjamin Anderson called the American era, which is the reshaping of Thailand through the Cold War and the Vietnam War. And Benjamin has done a really interesting job, but we aren't even going to be able to dig much into it because there's a lot going on here today. But I just want to highly recommend this book. And Benjamin is the Associate Professor of Critical Music Theory at SUNY Stony Brook. His first monologue, which is pertinent for today, is called Bangkok is Ringing, Sound, Protest, and Constraint, which was published in 2019. And he's because he's an ethnomusicologist, but he's much more than that. And his new book was published this year by Duke. So without further ado, we're going to first turn to Jeffrey, then to Benjamin, then to Nedwit, and then to all of us. So thank you.
It's great to be here. And I thought one way to start, do you want to just play the there's just a short music clip by a group called Rap Against Dictatorship, which I'll then bring up. But I think to have some sense of the sound of protest rap music in Asia is something to have in your mind. It's just a minute-long clip when they won an award from Index on Censorship. Index on Censorship put together a little clip about them. If it's easy to play, if it's hard, don't worry about it.
We will try. I will have to change. I might have to change the microphones.
Yeah, sure.
Oh.
All right, great. I thought that was just a little bit of a teaser and just an added thing. Jody Ginsburg, who was head of Index on Censorship at the time, is now head of Committee to Protect Journalism and is largely dealing with issues in protecting journalists in America and around the world as well. So what I wanted to do was quickly talk about what's a China specialist like me doing, going into Southeast Asia, to work on a book, Milk Tea Alliance, that, came out. I was calling it a sequel to Vigil, my book about Hong Kong, but a reviewer just very neatly said it's actually they go together like a diptych. Two panels that sort of illuminate each other. So I was trained as a China specialist, and I'd never read a book on Hong Kong in a graduate program, because Hong Kong was seen as kind of peripheral to Chinese history. Now at this point, it's become more part of it. But I was doing a dissertation on Chinese student movements of the first half of the 20th century. And because East Asia tends to be studied separately than Southeast Asia, nobody really told me you should read up on Thailand, like in 1976. I mean, and then even in 1989, when I was finished my dissertation and there was the massacre, I was vaguely aware of there had been an uprising that ended a massacre in Burma the year before, but I hadn't really thought of it as part of what I was studying. People had this idea of saying that if you were working on protests in the People's Republic of China, the relevant place to look would be at Eastern Europe and Central Europe, which was interesting to look at, but actually, over time, I've now realized how it can impoverish sometimes our sense of this. I worked on other issues besides protests for a while, because I thought the kinds of protests I had studied had stopped happening in China. And then in the 2010s, there were the protests in Hong Kong that looked a lot like the protests of the early 20th century and then 1989, and were connected to 1989 through a vigil that was held to commemorate the martyrs of 1989, which couldn't be done on the mainland, but could be done in Hong Kong. So I wrote this book, Vigil, and I finished it in 2019 while the protests were still going on, after having taken part in the June 4th, 1989, commemoration of 1989 vigil in Hong Kong. And then once it was done, I was fascinated by starting to see images come out of Bangkok that reminded me powerfully of the things I had just been writing about with Hong Kong. And I knew vaguely about Netivit and tried to bring Joshua Wong from Hong Kong to Bangkok in 2016. And the Thai authorities, under pressure probably, or collaboration with the Chinese authorities, blocked him at the airport and sent him back. What's very interesting that I sort of didn't know until this was a peripheral, when I dug into it and found out more about it, they were bringing Joshua Wong, who was associated with a city where the commemoration of a massacre was a major part of protest, to talk on the campus on the anniversary of the 1976 massacre, on the 40th. So there was a connection between these kinds of things and friendship between the two of them before the term Milk Tea Alliance was coined. So there was a sense of interconnectedness between East and Southeast Asia. But what I want to do to get to the music side of it is, when I was working on Vigil, I was interested in popular culture. I was interested in the imaginative side of activism, and I always have been interested in symbolism. I asked participants in the movement and people, did some interviews, and a collaborator, Amy Hawkins, did some interviews too. And we asked Hong Kongers, was there any novel or film that they thought spoke to the place that what Hong Kong was going through? And we got some expected answers like 1984. Well, we got a funny answer, Titanic, because the city was going down, but some people were just going to party until it's gone. But when I interviewed finally somebody quite young, she said there's one thing you really need to pay attention to. That's the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is what my generation has been reading and thinking about and used to think about with the I also was interested peripherally in the music during the Hong Kong protests, where one song that was important was "Do You Hear the People Sing," which on my one slide is from Tammy Ho, the poet, did an analysis of what "Do You Hear the People Sing," which is usually treated as a global song of protest that's sung around the world from Les Miserables. In Hong Kong, it was sung in English, but also in Cantonese. In the Cantonese version, a great thing about songs when they move across borders is you translate it, but it also has to be singable. So there's often a lot of free translation. In Cantonese, she analyzed, it means, have you spoken up yet? or who has not spoken up yet, which gives the impression that of course they're not going to listen to us. But don't you want to be remembered as somebody who raged against the dying of the light? Sure. So I was fascinated by that tidbit about music that came in there. And then when the Thailand protests were starting to unfold, Do You Hear the People Sing was one of the songs, sing in Thai. And so when I started doing the research for the Milk Tea Alliance, I decided that rather than ask about novels and films, I would ask about music. And I've always cared about music. The first interest I had in protest was my family, when I was a little kid, taking me to an anti-Vietnam War protest, and Joan Baez sang. And then I was sort of hooked on this as a topic to study. So it was very natural to do that. And I thought in my mind that I can come into this partly with American protest songs on my mind. But when I was interviewing people, I knew about rap against dictatorship a bit. I thought, okay, now I need to learn about rap music. I need to listen to more of it. Do You Hear the People Sing? I looked into Les Miserables. And then I interviewed Nedibit, long distance. And I said, are these the songs? And I was kind of leading questions. There's also a song from the Hunger Games, The Hanging Tree, that had become some political meanings. And the Hunger Games came in because the three-finger salute from that was being used on the streets. But I asked Nedibit, I thought, that in my mind was, of course, nobody's going to be talking about the music that I first associated with protests, which was American folk songs. And I said, did you like, Do You Hear the People Sing? Yeah, I like that, fine. I said, you're friends with people from Rap Against Dictatorship? You guys said, yeah. But what I really care about is We Shall Overcome. And Pete Seeger is one of my heroes. Where Have All the Flowers Gone? So I really felt I had a kindred spirit here. So I have a few slides here that I'll wrap this up pretty quickly, but except to say that one reason why I followed the story from Hong Kong to Thailand, these were the two places along with Taiwan that first were talking about the Milk Tea Alliance, this idea of being connected by worry about Beijing's rising power and trying to influence, trying to get people to hew to lines that Beijing asserted, or else they would be boycotted or they would be hassled online. When people in those three places banded together to push back against support each other in 2020, they coined the term Milk Tea Alliance to describe the fact that along with disliking authoritarianism, being worried about a rising Beijing, they were all from places where the iconic form of tea was a different kind of milk tea drink. Whereas on the mainland, the iconic form of tea is without milk. So it was a very clever popular culture thing. So there started to be icons of tea, different kinds of tea, but had something in common, swearing allegiance to each other. But then Myanmar, when there was the coup in early 2021, suddenly I was seeing images out of there where Do You Hear the People Sing was again one of the songs being sung. The three-finger salute, which had taken off as a dominant thing in Thailand, was picked up in Myanmar. In Hong Kong, they hadn't had the three-finger salute, but they'd had a slogan from the Hunger Games, if we burn, you burn with us, which was sometimes used in the other places. So there's this kind of symbolic connection between things, including via music. But I wanted to just show some images here to just sort of talk you through that very briefly, give you some ideas. This is the Tammy Ho dissecting analysis of Do You Hear the People Sing? Next is one of the other musicians that was important in my early years and showed up was John Lennon's Imagine. It wasn't a song that was sung often on the streets, but the slogan from it, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one, was important in the Hong Kong protests. And Lenin walls, which were borrowed from Prague in honor of him, were used. There was the last protest in Hong Kong that I observed, giant one of the last ones, December 8th, 2019. There, the Hunger Games was so much on people's minds that when Agnes Chow, who's the young activist I profile in the chapter on Hong Kong in the new book, when she was running for office, her friends made up a poster of her cosplaying Katniss Everdeen, the hero from the Hunger Games. By the way, in the Hunger Games, it's teenagers rise up against autocrats and defeat them. Sorry, spoiler alert if you haven't seen any of that. So they had her dressed up that way as the Younger Games. And then when I was researching the Thailand, I found a great collection of materials in Amsterdam, ephemera from the movements. And here is Katniss Everdeen image from from the movie with a slogan that I've been told means essentially, let it end with this generation. And this was which is kind of like this urgency of youth and feeling that there had been an older generation had just kicked things down the can, and we really needed to solve this with a kind of urgency, was something that connected these movements as well. This is the other activist I spent the most time talking to when I was in Thailand on my brief visits, besides Netuit, and he has he's holding up "History is Not Kind to Men Who Play God," which is actually from a James Bond movie. And this is a collection of ephemera from the 2020 protests. His name is Francis, and he was charged with a version of Lèse Majesté, actually interfering with the Queen's motorcade. When a protest that he and another activist were leading accidentally blocked a motorcade, and he ended up fighting that. He was ended up not convicted on that. He managed to do this. He has wonderful things with popular culture, but the reason why he's in here and something on music is in Hong Kong, after Do You Hear the People Sing and some other songs became very important, Hong Kongers wrote their own song. One Hong Konger did and just took off like crazy, Glory to Hong Kong, which became the anthem of the movement. The last time when I was there, the only song that you heard on the streets was Glory to Hong Kong, with the crowd all singing it and echoing across the buildings. And it sounds like a national anthem. It has the kind of musical elements to it. So you have all these different genres. There were also some hymns that people sang. It's a very kind of cosmopolitan mix of genres there. But Glory to Hong Kong was then banned in 2020, when the national security law came in. And if you sing Glory to Hong Kong on the streets of Hong Kong, you'll be arrested. Even a busker playing the melody can get arrested for that. So one of the things that happened in Thailand in 2020 was activists in the Milk Tea Alliance would show solidarity by doing things in their city that couldn't be done in the city of the other people in this. So Joshua Wong in 2020, just before he was arrested, went outside of the Thai consulate in Hong Kong and protested police brutality in Thailand. And it was not yet illegal, or it's not illegal, to protest police brutality in Thailand, in Hong Kong. And then Francis, on October 1st, National Day, China, went outside of the Chinese embassy in Bangkok and sang out Glory to Hong Kong as a way of showing solidarity and substituting. And this was a musical version of something that I found very touching about. There were some Hong Kongers who sent gear to protect you from tear gas to their friends in Thailand, because we are not using this anymore. We're not on the streets. We can't be on the streets, but you might have a use for this. And the activists in Bangkok who told me this story, friends of Netuit and Setanans, told me about this story and said they were then trying to think of how they could pay their Hong Kong friends back. And the way they did it was to hold a June 4th commemorative candlelight vigil on their campus and share photographs of it with their Hong Kong friends to say, we're doing what you can't do, as a way of connecting there. So then the photograph there, maybe after Rap Against Dictatorship won the Index on Censorship Award, they won the Havel Prize from that's given out by the Human Rights Foundation for creativity and dissent. And Havel is somebody who Netuit's the group that he founded, and others is a collective that does translations, and they've done Havel. So there's a kind of fitting there, and that's Netuit, a younger Netuit, standing with his two friends from Rap Against Dictatorship, posting about them winning, congratulating Rap Against Dictatorship. He doesn't say congratulations. They're not my favorite singers, but I like them. I admire their activism. And you like them, okay? Yeah. Okay. And then finally, there's Rap Against Junta, which is an example of the kind of idea of a baton being handed off from Hong Kong to Thailand to then Myanmar, Burma. There was a group, Rap Against Junta, inspired by Rap Against Dictatorship. And they actually did a music video, Dictators Must Die, which included rappers from other parts of Asia, including Indonesia. And I'm trying to remember if the Philippines is in there too. There were tentative moments when the Philippines and Indonesia were seen as members of the Milk Tea Alliance too. Again, they're milk tea places. And the Philippines gets a passing mention in my book because I interviewed a Burmese activist from 1988 who said that the reason why he and his group thought they might be able to overthrow a dictatorship was because they were aware of what had happened in the Philippines. So I think the term Milk Tea Alliance is new, but this idea of watching people in nearby places is something that carries over. So Rap Against Junta does this kind of like We Are the World style collage of snippets of rap music in different languages to draw attention to the shared concerns. Well, I did there. Thanks.
Now to Benjamin.
Okay. Well, I have some prepared remarks, but I kind of just want to share first my thanks as well as my immediate responses after having heard you speak, which is frankly excitement. I think that there's a real urgency to the conversation that we're having right now in this world that has to do with transnational connections in the face of certain structurations of repression, fascism, and so forth that have asserted themselves not so much locally, but in fact in more diffuse, broader, more wide-ranging fashions. And I think to some degree, it is urgent now to think generatively and together about ways in which dissidents, protesters in very different places can kind of see our own struggles in other people and not just connect to them, but actually unite them. I think there's a real urgency in that. And I think moreover, that there's a lot of potential for scholarship to contribute some theorizations of how ideas travel, which we've done for a long time, including in music studies. In fact, I'm quite excited about what music studies might be able to contribute to this, because I think we have some pretty robust theories about how musical ideas travel. I do think that theorizing these things is going to require more than thinking about solidarities, however, because there are also risks, there are downsides to the kind of internationalization of ideas, right? The flow of ideas. There's risks there as well, but that's precisely why we really have to theorize this stuff well. So I'm excited to be doing that. So thank you. Thank you for your very, very nice, kind introduction and mention of my book, which I do have copies of, by the way. You have to do that when you have a new book. Apologies for crassness. But my name is Benjamin Tausig. I'm Associate Professor of Critical Music Studies at Stony Brook University. And I'm going to start today by discussing the trajectory from my first monograph to my second, as a means of opening toward a discussion of protest music and the transnational circulation of both protest and music. I'm thankful to Jeffrey Wasserstrom for inviting me to present alongside him, to NYSEAN, to Margaret Scott for organizing, to John Gershman and Emily Tumali for helping with logistics, and a special thank you also to Netivit for being here. You are an activist who I've admired for years, and it's a real honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you. So my first book was called Bangkok is Ringing, and that's depicted on the right, Sound, Protest, and Constraint. It was published in 2019, and it was an effort to produce a sound studies ethnography, which had not been done often. Sound studies as a kind of intellectual ferment has roots that go back at least 40 or 50 years, but it sort of began settling as a discipline in 2000 or so. A lot of the earliest work in sound studies was historical or philosophical or situated in media studies. Not much had been done ethnographically at that time. And training as an ethnomusicologist, as I was doing, I was drawn to try that approach, that methodology with sound studies. I did my PhD training right here at NYU in the second half of the 2000s, starting in 2006. And then I went to Thailand for fieldwork in 2010 and 11. When a major wave of anti-government protests, called the Red Shirt Movement, that's what's depicted in that photograph, occurred in Bangkok and other Thai cities in those years, political dissent and its sound became my primary focus. I applied concerns, questions, and methods from sound studies to think about how these unfolding events were governed by or related to sound. I spent long days at protest gatherings, at strategy sessions, on buses, during cross-country drives, in the homes of protesters, and so on, always with my sound recorder by my side. I was thinking about protest music, but I was also thinking about protest sound more generally, including the media systems through which that sound was being broadcast and circulated. In retrospect, that period of time, around 2010, was a historical watershed for dissent globally, I think, especially in terms of media and mediation. Probably the best known movements of that time were the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, and the protests against Erdogan in Turkey. But Thailand's red shirt protests were also part of that moment. That was probably the first wave of global protests to utilize social media and related tools for organizing at scale. Twitter and YouTube in particular proved crucial for mobilizing bodies in the street, albeit not nearly to the degree that the same platforms would be used a few years later for the Black Lives Matter movement and others. In 2010 and 11, those tools were still fairly new, and they had a bit of a technophile or even an elite sheen to them. A lot of people didn't have regular internet connections in Thailand, among other countries at that point. But those technologies were also becoming tools for exactly the kind of transnational recognition and exchange that Jeffrey examines in his Milk Tea Alliance book. I was thinking comparatively with Bangkok is Ringing, just as Jeffrey is doing with his most recent book. One striking thing I observed in 2010 and 11 was that the same media tools and platforms were affording very similar opportunities to dissidents living and protesting in far-flung places. Not only could dissidents across the world observe and borrow from one another, but they were often using exactly the same devices and circulatory tools. This often resulted in very similar tactics used in very different places. And simply to give one example, there was a lot of silence at protests in 2010 and 11 because you could document people being silent in the face of noisy surroundings, in the face of police repression. There was a great deal of power to standing silently or meditating or lying on the ground. And we saw this in movement after movement. We saw it all the time in the Arab Spring. There was one specific protester in Gezi Park who did that all the time. There was a meditating protester who I documented in Thailand. The silence became an expression that emanated from the possibilities of the media that people had access to at that time. Yeah, around 2010, I think we saw the first stirrings of a transformation that both activists and scholars are still grappling with, and which I'm looking forward to talking about today. A moment where deeper and quicker tools of exchange could both circulate models of dissent across borders while simultaneously exposing dissidents to new levels of surveillance and exposure that severely constrains their work or can. We certainly need to be cognizant of the different and often contradictory affordances of these tools, including in how they relate to sonic communication and expression and music. In the conclusion of Bangkok is Ringing, which discusses the status of Thai dissidents, in the middle of the 2010s, I describe an already advancing wave of state surveillance by way of the same technologies that the red shirts had used to organize a few years earlier. The state caught on and co-opted technologies, as they always do. Since Bangkok is Ringing was published, I've done research and writing for a second book, this one, which itself was published in spring of this year, depicted on the left. It's called Bangkok After Dark. And this book was animated by several lingering questions from the first book, some musical and sonic, some political, and some less so. One crucial question was narrowly about the instrument that you see at the very top of the middle row of photographs, called the pin, which I learned to play from a musician who performed at the Red Shirt protests, and which was both common and deeply symbolic for the Thai Red Shirt movement, as it was associated with rurality and poverty, and thus it sounded out some of the most important self-identifications of the red shirt people. This instrument, far from being historically disconnected from any place outside of Northeast Thailand or Laos, is in fact profoundly cosmopolitan, which I had long sensed simply from hearing it. In brief, the modern pin, or pin prayuk, is electrified and sounds almost psychedelic. It is in fact often marketed as a psychedelic instrument, when American or European reissue labels package older recordings that include it. I suspected, and my research ultimately confirmed, that the sound of this instrument developed during the era of the American War in Vietnam, when Thailand and the United States were very, very friendly, and when US soldiers spent time on military bases or enjoying R&R breaks in various Thai cities. My research for the second project then was historical, though it was also aided by interviews with living subjects who were present in Thailand during the 60s and 70s. The figure at the center of the book, depicted there, Maurice Rocco, is an American jazz musician who lived the last 12 years of his life in Bangkok before he was murdered by two young male sex workers in 1976. Rocco is the main character, but not the sole focus of the book, which is more broadly about Thai-American relations and how these manifested in scenes of music and nightlife during the long 1960s. But, and here's where we come back to the main thread. The book is also very much about transnational exchange, including the ways that genres like psychedelic music have traveled from places like the United States to places like Thailand in ways that might preserve recognizable sonorities and forms, while at the same time transforming their meanings. The sound of the electrified pin, for example, which is usually heard as psychedelic to American or European ears nowadays, and you can see that kind of how that manifests in marketing terms at the image in the bottom, where it's a sort of a conventionally psychedelic image transposed onto Thai instruments and text. The sound of the electrified pin, which is usually heard as psychedelic to American or European ears, would not be categorized the same way in Thailand, where the very notion of psychedelia is all but non-existent. The sound of the pin was closely modeled on the common timbre of an electric guitar in the prime years of psychedelia, roughly 1967 to 1971. But Thai musicians and listeners did not ascribe anywhere close to the same meanings to this music. They did not hear the electric pin as sounding out the libertine or politically radical sentiments of the Beatles or Jimi Hendrix or the Velvet Underground. Music studies is relatively well attuned to the differences that arise when one musical form influences another form in a different socio-political context. And I found plenty of evidence of this in studying the Thai music of the 60s and 70s. In this book, I'm very much thinking about musical circulation, including the generative potential of floating signifiers. Maurice Rocco, the book's main character, was both at home in Thailand playing jazz, a musical form that was well loved and well compensated there. But he also encountered slippages in reception, ranging from different valuations or even definitions of jazz to different valuations of his own existence as a musician, as a Black man, as a queer person in particular. This sameness and difference across a transnational border is a key focus of the book. But I've also been thinking about what stays the same, or even gets reasserted across both time and space, when music circulates and recirculates across borders. I begin to feel that music studies is at times perhaps a bit overcommitted to the idea that music, as it travels, exists in a state of perpetual semiotic drift, that every place a piece of music is heard anew confers a new meaning and context. This is contradicted, in fact, by certain empirical examples, some of which notably involve semantic latencies. For example, the psychedelic sound of the pin that I've been discussing was without question substantially a product of Black music making and experimentation. Psychedelic rock was formally grounded in blues shredding, and the same guitarists who influenced early rock and roll, like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, were keystones for the psychedelic form of rock. This is, of course, without even mentioning Jimi Hendrix or the Latin influences on which Carlos Santana drew. Black musicality, in addition to South Asian music making, among others, was very much a wellspring of the exotic appeal of psychedelic rock. Perhaps Thai musicians who were influenced by psychedelic rock were unaware of these racial histories, as indeed these histories were often sublimated when psychedelic rock records circulated through Thailand in the 60s. But later in history, those same putatively psychedelic recordings recirculated back to the United States and Europe, where they were marketed as rare, obscure, long-lost vintage objects. First world audiences now hear those albums as exotic once again in the 21st century. And I would suggest that the exoticism they perceive is in fact rooted in the same historically Black idioms that infused the music in the first place. Though latent for many decades and along many paths of circulation, racialized hierarchies of listening and the old exoticism heard in the Blackness of psychedelia have fundamentally reasserted themselves in the 21st century. We could surely find differences, but I think we might also do well to consider the ways that persistent structural forces, including racial hierarchy and colonial power, can govern how music is received in common ways across time and space. The ways that I've been thinking about musical circulation, semantic drift, and some version of retention located more in listening than in sound are absolutely parallel with how I've been thinking about the circulation of dissent since 2010. Music and protest present us with very similar analytical challenges when considered transnationally or in circulation. When is meaning maintained or altered? How do hearing and mishearing function? And where can we identify solidarities or similar patterns of reception? How does protest, like music, travel across the world in ways that sometimes involve semantic drift, but also sometimes yield commonalities? How might centering protest music as a material expressive form of dissent allow us to consider not only how protest appears, but how it is received, heard, and in the process boxed in or constrained? Bangkok After Dark is not explicitly about protest music, but all the music discussed in it is politically laden at the scale of geopolitics. Music circulated between Thailand and the US as a material for individual self-definition, as a source of soft power, as a locus of unity, and as an industry in its own right. Theorizing the politics of this musical circulation have brought me to think about how music circulates among protest movements, and indeed how the circulation of music can also tell us about the complex circulation of ideas, strategies, and solidarities. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you both. Now, I just want to say that I find that Benjamin has this way of being extremely theoretical and then extremely concrete. And it is something that many scholars don't know how to do. And I just hats off to you for doing that. It's really quite amazing.
And I was just gonna say, there's a video, I don't know which one of the book talks you did, that's illustrated with clips of the piano playing.
Oh, yeah.
And the film, which is just fantastic. It was mind-blowing because it's actually it's a precursor to Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard that and I had never heard of it, and I thought it's great.
We're hoping during the reception that we'll be able to give you a taste of Maurice Rocco. But now I'd like to have our special guest comment.
Thank you, everyone. And since I have very little time to prepare, I'm just talking about my experience, my activism with music in very general. For me, music is like a mantra. It's like a prayer, when you play in the church or in the temple. For me, it have something that can change people's mind or can bring some harmonies happening. This is happening in Buddhism. When monks actually they pray in Bali, they call it like sing a song. It's actually it sings, sing a song. Yeah, and in Thailand, I think normally we grow up with songs, with propaganda song, especially. We go to the school in every morning. We have to go and to stand up and then respect for the national flag and sing the national anthem. This is happening since Second World War, that the government at that time tried to have young people and people in general to be very patriotic. And even nowadays, 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. in many public space, you will hear the national anthem and everyone just stand up. Yeah, which this is what happening. This is what we learn in school, and we also have a lot of songs about the kings, especially the last one that quite popular among people. So when I still in secondary school, we have a lot of events related to the birthday of the king or the queen, something like that. And yeah, I am very good student at first, So I quite memorized about this song in my head. And also I quite very feel, how to say, very impressed with the lyrics of the song that I to convey to students. Yeah, but because when I grow up, I know that I have been brainwashed for many years. And I learned about 6 October 1976 that students at Tausig University had been killed, massacred by soldiers and the state. Yeah, and I also feel very sad and want to, have justice be back to these people, those people who have been killed. So I learned about the history, and one of the things that these people try to, the activists at that time try to, bring justice for their friends was through music. So I learned a lot of music by activists, and also by one person that I think is have a lot of influence to me at first, Jitpumisak.
Yeah.
Jitpumisak, he was a revolutionary. Actually, also he also studied at Chulalongkorn University, which I also studied there, and he have been like a troublemaker in his university like me, and yeah. And finally, yeah, he can graduate, but he, I think he feel alienated with society around. So he went to the jungle and joined with Communist Party and had been killed. But in his very short life, only 30, I think 36 or 38 years, he translated and published and invented many songs that, used in Communist Party Thailand. And for me, these songs very, influenced me. I always listen to these songs since I'm still in high school. So you see, I'm very radical since then. Yeah. And yeah, Pumisak make me to know about the song that he translate. One is the Anthem, the International. Yeah, which communist song. Yeah, and yeah, very it made me want to do something to change society. Yeah, and I think because of Jitpumisak song that I come to know about Peace Seeker. Yeah, to learn about, because Peace Seeker also, he also sang International in French and in English version. Yeah, and because I discovered Peace Seeker, I think we shall overcome. This song, he sing very simple in his song in YouTube. You can search it, but I don't know. It feels very powerful. It like a player that people, not him. Peace Seeker, his style. One thing that I think is quite impressed me is that he always invite us to sing with him. This is one thing that different from many other singers. So when I hear him singing with people in his audience, I feel this is what we need in our society. Not just the leader to, when we protest, to speak and everyone listen, but how to make people engage, how to make them as one of the people that equal with leaders. So this is something that obsessed me, because when I learn about 6 October event, I also think about how we can, look forward to the future, that not be like in the past that the movement have been failed, and the military always came to take power again and again. How we can do that? So at that time, I was thinking that song can be mean for something. Yeah, and song by Peace Seeker help me to learn and maybe to identify myself as conscious objector from where have all the flowers gone, right? And even the Viva la Brigada that he talk about, he sing about Spanish Republic against Franco. That also very interesting or amazing place that also helped me to learn more about abolitionists. Yeah, and nowadays, the song, the progressive song in the past, the communist song that have been quite progressive in the past now, actually is still not, been banned in Thailand, but it now become this a song in sport days. So because they try to, you have to patriotic, you have to make yourself over. It's not become dangerous anymore. Thailand have some way, Thai state have some way to accommodate this thing and make it to be just normal, to be in sports. So yeah, I think this is one of very interesting way to cope with radical song. And maybe I have to my time will be in soon. So I hope that I think that one thing that I want to do back in Thailand, I think is very interesting topic is that I think when the protest movement happening in 2020, that time young people in my generation, I think they quite remember a lot of songs. They know about protest song, But as young people nowadays, people thinking that they don't care about politics. Maybe because they don't know any song that happening in that time. So we should do some research on that. Yeah, thank you.
So I want to open it to questions, but I was thinking maybe the two of you could talk to each other a little bit and maybe even comment on what Nedivit has been saying. As I'd like to hear a little bit more about the urgency of now and where music and protest might play a role, because for many people, there's what Nedivit last said was that it seems that young people have given up or they feel overwhelmed, but it depends. Madagascar, Nepal, I mean, there's a lot of things going on in the world, but is there solidarity? Is there a movement? Are there songs? So a little bit more on the urgency of now, how you would talk about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one thing I was struck and thinking during your comments, Netivi, was the stubborn tendency for certain musical circulations to only move in one direction, right? So there's a long history of Thailand and Thai protesters becoming cognizant of American and European songs. There's not really a movement in the other direction. And I think it probably is important that there would be, because it's very unfortunate, right, that like these sort of patterns of circulation that we find in like commerce and global power would be reasserted in dissident scenes, right, which should be disconnected from those things, right? Like protesters should be not reiterating the like sort of global soft power patterns, right? So, I mean, I guess I don't know if I have a question or if that's just a comment, but I mean, I'm wondering sort of like how to break that pattern, how to break that, the stubborn one-wayness of that flow.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me be part of a Southeast Asia event. It's really exciting for me. And I've also just been so glad to not be made to feel like an interloper. I've done things with Meredith and it's been wonderful. And I've collaborated with Thai scholars, and it's really been an exciting way of enriching things. So maybe there's even a form of hierarchies within things like Asian studies, where China had enlarged together. I always think, for me, I guess music. Well, I'm fascinated by music. I feel like it's a latecomer to focus on this in my work, because I write songs and I came into protest partly thinking of music, and then it took me a while to integrate that side of my life with this. But I do keep thinking of music as in part of a larger structure of popular culture and symbols. And now with what's going on now in Nepal and in before that Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and what's going on right now in Indonesia, there is something of the integration of popular culture into movements, which I think is something that happens to a lesser degree at the moment in the United States, whereas if in an earlier time, it was certainly the popular culture side of the 1960s, with the integration of counterculture and movements was very interesting. But I've had some people think that the youth side of pop culture symbols, now it's the pirate flag, but also in Indonesia, somebody just on social media had seen my stuff about the Hunger Games and said that in Indonesia now, the song Hanging Tree from the Hunger Games is very important, and that's an interesting kind of circulation. But we didn't mention a couple of things I just wanted to mention. One is that the use of propaganda songs, there have been efforts in the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party is putting out like rap songs and things to try to instill political messages. But they've never had a leader of the country actually write songs which Freya wrote, happiness comes to Thailand or things like these that was trying to position himself as a musical figure there. So that was one thing that sometimes it's official songs. And official songs can then sometimes, or non-political songs can sometimes be twisted into having political meanings. And when you mentioned Jimi Hendrix, I think of his reinvention of the Star Spangled Banner into a kind of mind-blowing song was an example of that. In the first time I wrote about protest music in China context, it was about the new words that Chinese protesters put to the song Frère Jacques. Decade after decade, they would redo Frère Jacques. It's a great song to turn into a protest song because it's a repetitive thing. And it's the only song from my work that I will ever sing in public. And the only time I will sing in Chinese. Da dao yiga, deng xiaoping, haiyue liang man, yan chong kun. That was just from 1989. If we knock down Deng Xiaoping, there'll still be other bullies, like Yan Changkun. And that was done in 1989. And it was something, the Red Guards sang a version of it, Down with Imperialism. But even in the 1920s and 30s, and it was sometimes sung by Communist Party supporters, and yet it could be sung to challenge the Communist Party. So these, I think it's a wonderful thing about flow, but your part about the flow in one direction rather than the other, the Hunger Games thing just fascinates me because a very smart analyst of media studies, Anxiao Mina, who's written a book From Memes to Movements. It's really very sophisticated. I admire their work a lot, but made the prediction that the three-finger salute would go global. Because what a great, she was saying you can go into a protest and hold it up and it's complete deniability because everybody comes to the protest with a hand. And there's no reason why it couldn't be like the fist or it couldn't be something that takes, but it hasn't, even though it started in the West. It's a Hollywood and American writer, popular, and goes there, but it doesn't circulate back. And only in Southeast Asia, as far as I know, do people sing, do you hear the people sing while holding up three fingers? Both of them are imports, but they become something, a hybrid form that only exists there, which you can think of as like the flow doesn't go in both directions, but you also think of it, the incredible creativity of blending these styles.
So I think we should open up. Who has some questions? Sydney, then Meredith, please.
So I guess this is related as well to the issue of the urgency of now. And it's not so much music, but the Milk Tea Alliance failed. The uprisings in August across Nepal, Indonesia, Philippines, Timor-Leste, so far have failed in the sense of articulating anything but anger against corruption. They haven't succeeded in articulating a goal or producing a leader that can bring these movements together. So beyond music, how do you mobilize that resistance and that anger toward actually something constructive and lasting? And I guess that's coming as much from the United States right now as it is from Southeast Asia.
So I was thinking about when Benjamin said that the 2010 is the start of this period. There's a really important, interesting book, Vincent Bevan's, If We Burn. And what it is a global look at the 2010s, protests across there. And his question, which is different, I guess my question is often, how do these things work? What do people do when they're on the streets? And his question was, because he had been following these things, especially in Brazil, but around the world, what do we make of the fact that that was a bigger decade of protest than ever in the history of the world, and yet you had few results that were like what anybody wanted. In the same way that even Arab Spring, which initially felt like the success story, ends up with replications of things. So his question, and he was asking activists, what do you make of this thing? My only thing, and this I'll mention with Ed's a good example of this. I was wondering in thinking of the United States, I was struck by the fact that Viktor Orban has been invited to speak to MAGA groups as a way, like a model from someplace else that people trying to take the country in that direction could learn from. But I wondered, after there was the successful blocking of martial law in South Korea, was there a similar interest in figuring out what the lessons from there could be? And I got in some of the pushback because I said, where are the articles about that in the progressive press? There were some articles, but there wasn't an intense, there wasn't a focused attention.
And there's a big pushback against Orban recently.
Right, but then I looked online and Netwit had organized something at his campus, bringing in people from South Korea to say, what can we learn about Thai democracy? I think it's like, it's also sort of, where do we look? And that's, I think, one of the questions. Occasionally people will look, like Tiananmen, people would look to China, Hong Kong, people would China, to Hong Kong. But I mean, even when they're failures.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's just a sort of, there's a short attention span moment. It's hard to pay attention to everywhere. But I think activists within, my interest in the Milk Tea Alliance wasn't that it succeeded, but I was interested in the way there was an effort for mutual learning.
Yeah.
And I've been hearing from the journalists who have interviewed me to see if there's anything relevant of what I've been doing to think about Nepal and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. When they've been interviewing activists, the activists there have been looking at these. There's been a lot of mutual looking into the job. So certainly that mutual gaze part is interesting. But that's not answering your question.
But it's fair.
Do you have any, Dad?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would answer that question is to say that yet again, it's useful to think about music and political movements together, because all political movements fail and all music fails, in the sense that both are sort of deeply affective and either explicitly or implicitly make big promises, right? So you can think about the way that you know, songs that you've had maybe the most profound and emotional relationship to, right? You have this, to sort of borrow turn a phrase from Alex Ross, right? Music sort of presents the feeling that the world is about to undergo a profound change. And then it doesn't, right? And inevitably that music then becomes an object of disappointment after the fact. But I think it would be wrong to say that the music doesn't matter, right, as a result, right? Music still sort of leaves a trace, like it stays with us for a long time, even if it didn't deliver on its initial promise. And I think that political movements, especially those that are focused like in the street, are exactly the same. I think they tend to make very, very specific big promises. They feel like failures. And then later on, when the dust settles, you realize that they actually did make a difference.
Music that doesn't fail and that does provide the lasting inspiration is in insurgencies. Many times it's insurgent, I was telling Margaret
Yeah.
about Fretland songs in East Timor.
Mhm.
Those songs help galvanize the movement. and
Sure.
Help really inspire victory.
Yeah,
And I'm sure
yeah.
that's true in other insurgencies.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just think that victories are rarely clear cut,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, I've been thinking a lot recently about, and pardon me, I know this is a sensitive topic, but I want to introduce it. I think it's important to introduce it. I think that the pro-Palestine protests are really, really important to think about here. They feel like a failure, right? They were quashed on campuses. You know, there was all kinds of repression of those protests. They're rarer to see, like they're not non-existent, but they're much rarer now. You might feel disappointed, and then you see that public opinion actually changed dramatically about the issue. And I think that the protests had no small part in that. No matter how, where you fall politically, right? I think this is a fact. So the movement failed in the sense that it was sort of suppressed, right, as a visible thing. It did not achieve exactly what it, sort of said it was aiming for. And yet, in the end, we must say that something happened because of it, that it moved something. And I think that's frequently the case with political movements, as it is with music. So I think that failure is sort of okay, right? We can think about it. We can think about failure without sort of determining that nothing happened, right? They're not the same.
Great. Meredith?
Yeah, so these were, I mean, I've engaged a lot with this with Jeff's book already, and each time I seem to come up with, hear other things that I hadn't really thought of from it, and so Ben and Nettie went, oh, thanks for kind of highlighting some of those. So on the one hand, I was also struck, as Margaret was, by the sort of possibly neo-colonial or continuingly colonial aspect of Western music, but at the same time, there's this whole other dimension, which is, if we focus on the Hunger Games, and if you focus on a particular set of the folk singers, basically from the West, we get one image. Another is if we put the musical piece of this in line with the larger kind of cultural aspect of multi-life and of the country-specific protests of which it's part, we also see this whole aspect of intra-Asian referencing with K-pop and Hallyu and so forth. With you have to mention that, like the communist songs in the past. I was thinking of the banning in colonial Malaya and Singapore of any like Chinese instrumental music that was these spring awakening concerts and things like that. But the ways in which there are these other strands as well. So a couple things that are probably more comments than questions. I'm sorry, I'm going to try to put a question mark at the end. But one would be sort of thinking of this in terms of the real difficulty of speech, free speech in Thailand or in Hong Kong in particular, in Myanmar, versus what singing allows that speech per se doesn't, and that it's just, it can be sort of running through your head. It doesn't require an audience in the same way. It's more, I don't know how to say, I'm sure Ben, you have language for this, but just thinking about that as a way of communicating that can be, on the one hand, can be coded and subtle, but even when it's fairly overt, it becomes an earworm in a way that's just not going to happen. And so it's can be just as eloquent as a tweet sometimes, which is to say oversimplification and so forth, but you can get a main theme that carries differently. So really thinking of where these sorts of shorthand fit within a tactical repertoire for discourse in contemporary movements. Also considering the other aspect of this, which has been so well covered for places like Indonesia as well, of the memification of protest, or what conveys on social media after the fact. And that's part of why, the Milk Tea Alliance has been criticized for the fact that so much of it's an online platform and it's largely in English. And yet, if you don't understand the words of the music, you can get the tone of it. And after a while, somebody will translate the words for you anyway. So it's like the extent to which this combination of things, of the suppression of speech by ever more potent and more high capacity for surveillance states, coincides with these online platforms that transform where music specifically fits within this culture of protest in a highly performative activist era. This is just a real difference in some ways, in which you're performing for the local audience and with the expectation of both local and international audiences online. That itself is remarkable. The last thing I'll say, just because there's some interesting research on, including a recent really excellent Cornell PhD in political science, but on generations of protest in places like Myanmar and how how these traditions and so forth get passed on. Brian Patterson's work in the past on China and Cambodia as well. It's interesting then to think, okay, fine, Pete Seeger is one of those threads where you pick it up and it conveys this sort of whole set of meanings within the song. But how much some of these other, the Rap Against Dictator, these other songs, allow us to think differently about those generational threads and continuities that, yes, a movement dies down, the protest dies, the music dies, but how that allows this resurrection in particular dimensions in ways that aren't possible without those melodies, one might say, but also that it's not just the Pete Seegers, however important those also are, but whether there will be some of these threads that are like the Hong Kong, Glory to Hong Kong, like how much that will help to sort of spark up, oh, right, that's what we mean by this protest, in 10 years.
With Glory to Hong Kong, it becomes important within the diaspora
Oh, yeah.
to have
Oh,
something
absolutely, yeah,
that
yeah.
connects you. And also just one thing about the failure and success, if you want to retain some hopefulness, there's a recent book by Rebecca Solnit, No Straight Road Takes You There, where she talks about sometimes we have the mayfly view of history rather than the tortoise one, and talks about the very long term. And who knows where the world is going now, but if you look at certain kinds of examples, it's striking to me how many people, if they had died earlier, you would have looked at the arc of their life and said, they only struggled for an impossible thing. Václav Havel in 1980, he failed, 68, he's part of something that fails. 77, something that part of fails. And then, but if you have the arc at the end there, but then also, of course, it's not that the arc of the universe bends in the right way, because you also can then go to these places where Hungary was, to my mind, a success story, and then it becomes failure one. But there's a song in the Eastern European context. Actually, it begins as a Spanish song, and then it gets picked up and becomes very important during Solidarity. It's about walls. Then it gets rewritten in Belarus. It gets rewritten again in Belarus. So it becomes these things that get picked up on there, and sometimes they come out of something that you associate with that's associated with a failure, but then with Solidarity in 1980-81, it's associated with a success, but then with a failure. And in the K-pop side, along with K-pop, which was important in Thailand as well, there also are some songs that date back to Gwangju. Netuit has a lot of connection with activists in Gwangju was a failure. 1980 is this brutal Recta, and some of it still is inspiring, but then it eventually becomes incorporated into success.
Yeah, I mean, sort of thinking about a summative answer to your question. I've remained very guided by one specific article by Rosalind Morris, Theses on the New Öffentlichkeit, in which she suggests that there kind of is no public sphere anymore. And in the context of the sort of performativity of dissent, the necessary performativity of dissent in contexts of sufficient mediation and surveillance, like there's really nothing you can do other than show up so that you can be seen showing up, as opposed to communicating with anyone. And I think to some degree, a lot of what you're talking about is symptomatic of a kind of like a post-public sphere moment, including like, the way that music operates. I think, that music operates kind of like, it operates very well at the level of the mundane and the interior, which is something that, for example, like the labor movement knew really well, right? Like they wrote songs explicitly to be singable by working people who had no musical aptitude, right? But would remember like the Union marches on or whatever, and could kind of carry it with them, right? So it would sort of function in the everyday and would function inside of themselves, which were places that weren't really part of the public sphere, but were still effective, right? So it was like this sort of like end run around discourse, right? Like melody is almost like an end run around discourse.
Right? The potable line.
Yeah. If you want to have it's welcome
Bring it down.
to good homes, free good homes. But I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe I wonder if, 'cause, I mean, people are so savvy about social media now, and part of that manifests as exhaustion with it, where it's just sort of like there's nothing left here. But part of it also manifests as kind of knowing what it is. And I feel that way myself, where it's like you post on Blue Sky or whatever, Twitter or whatever. It's like you better know that like your audience for the most part is your employer and the state, right? So like say what you're gonna say, knowing that those people are watching, right? And maybe take advantage of that, right? Say because they're not going to listen to you, right? Like the emergency response management team is not like asking me my opinion about things, but I know that they're listening. So like I will tell them stuff, right, when I post online. And I'm mindful of borders and stuff like that, but like you can kind of make it into a public sphere a little bit. And I wonder if people have sort of figured out some ways to do that. That doesn't have anything to do with music. But that's my answer.
Okay.
Can I have some comments? Translation. I think it might be justice, to say that UTI and spell. Actually, it hasn't started. It's just naming some movement, someone called UT Alliance, and then everyone, oh, this is the phenomena, something happening. But now already long work because become naming UT Alliance. And because I think at that time, many people still quite surprised and activists, they haven't prepared much about what people might expect, what the plan, what the future of the movement should be. So it just retreat for a while, and I think it's still very early formative year of this movement.
I hope so.
Yeah, for sure.
It reminds me of what the misquoted reaction when Joe and I was asked about the French Revolution. It's too early. But more questions.
So we were briefly talking about the changing nature of the surveillance state. Okay. We were briefly talking about the nature of the surveillance state before this started, and since the Milk Tea Alliance was largely, facilitated through Twitter, and now Twitter is owned by Elon Musk, and it's, very probably fascist oriented. And also all of the social media platforms have drastically changed since this phenomenon began. How do you think these social media platforms are kind of foreclosing this possibility of transnational solidarity when it comes to these movements? And what do you think, do you imagine alternatives for ways that people can globally share things from protest movements, as we are realizing, anyone involved in these movements, these ways of avoiding the surveillance are getting less and less each day, right? Like on Instagram, you can still post text without it being flagged if you have an image behind it. I have a friend who, for example, will post I love Taylor Swift's new album and post a picture of her face, because your face will get more views than something else. And then, posting about Palestine solidarity will put spaces between words, you use numbers instead of letters, there's all these strategic things. Or maybe last year, some of you remember the use of hashtag warm winter boots on TikTok to counter, ICE, things like that. So, there's always creative ways that people come up with to avoid surveillance or to avoid the wrong person being able to prove that they're circulating these things. But how do you envision these kind of movements moving into the future, and will social media even be a tool that we can use?
Wow. There's a kind of chuckle among people who are used to China because the internet workaround, rice bunny was what you would put after the term Me Too was banned, because rice is me and bunny is too. But the kind of hopeful, it was a strange kind of hopefulness. It's amazing how many, even when technologies change, and at some point maybe technologies really do change everything, but at certain points, it's amazing the stickiness of old kinds of patterns, even with new technologies, and the double-edged nature of even some what seem to be completely liberatory technologies end up being repressive, but repressive technologies end up being integrated in protests. The most amazing protest out of China recently was a light projection of a edgy slogan that then was timed so that the person who did it was outside of the country by the time it went up. But he had set up cameras that would film his mother being hassled, which he knew was going to happen. So he was filming the surveillance state.
Yeah.
And a kind of, that was sort of one. The other one was I was mentioning to the veteran of 1988 protest, Chun Mit, who I profile in the book. And I talked to him about the 88 uprising, and then also he's been part of trying to raise awareness about the recent protests. And I was talking about change. I was saying, and it's much harder now because you have things like drones and surveillance, right? He said actually drones are helping some of the insurgents in Myanmar now. Because when he was a teenager, when there was a protest, the troops would just show up and they shot people. Now, there are members within the resistance, one use is that are very good with drones, and they're using drones to figure out where the military is going to come, and then moving to another spot, which is an example of kind of the Hong Kong v. Water thing, but using a high-tech thing. So it's just interesting how these things replicate, and in the public sphere, it may be gone, or it may be just, again, there may be just reinventions of things. Early theorist of the internet, Mark Poster, who was briefly in the same department as me, he died, but he had made a prediction after Tiananmen. He said, this might be the last time, the way the internet is going, this may be the last time that large numbers of people gathering together in a square is going to matter. Then we had Tahrir, and we had all kinds of other settings where people getting together. And it's all like the Milk Tea Alliance. This was part of what came out of this was with talking to Netivit, or his example. It was seen as an online movement, online-only movement, but his connection to Joshua Wong was because he went to Hong Kong and found the guy and convinced him that they should work together. And when they tried to just, it's always an interplay between face-to-face and meeting.
What do you think the future of social media platforms?
I don't know that I can speculate. I'd be interested in hearing Netivit's thoughts.
What do you think? Yeah, are you still using online platforms, social media platforms?
Not much,
Yeah.
but yeah, I still try to convey to people. But for me, I now want to focus more on public space, and I think we have some statistics that more and more people also concerned with surveillance, and so they want to focus on the public space or private physical space, not just online. So I think it's become more and more important. But in Thailand and in many places, these spaces have been banned or have been obstacles to growth. So how to make that more openly accessible to people, still very big question. That they want to privatize everything.
It's ironically very relevant to be at NYU, where I know there are issues of NYU's real estate development things, because Netivit's university was kind of the counterpart in Bangkok, and some of his activism has been anti-gentrification activism recently to try to preserve these unexpected. But isn't the shrine an example of something that has become a more important space because of the efforts to privatize it, the pushing back? We're looking for hopeful stories.
Yeah, now I think I involved with the preservation movement to protect the Southeast shrine in the heart of Chulalongkorn University. And 5 years ago when we start the movement, I think that time nobody know about it and nobody care about this heritage. I think it's just some superstition thing. But now today I think more and more young people, now they're going there, they're going to worship, but not worship, but going to have dialogue, intergenerational dialogue with people, with elders people. So I think young people, they always trying to find, something meaningful, not just, social media, but also want to talk, want to have their own embodiment of that space. Yeah, and the try that we try to help, try to protect, prove that quite popular among young people. And if you now go to Bangkok, I think you can find someone recommend for sure that you should go to this show.
Please.
So I think, it's kind of a big topic to many people right now that the world democracy is something of a retreat. I think if you look at the US, I think that the US has kind of abandoned its kind of like role as the flag bearer for the world democracy across the world, whereas, or thinking that it's like responsible for supporting the world democracy. I was surprised during the Hong Kong protests that there were a lot of like American symbolism. I think kind of an idea of looking to America as like an exemplar. I think that nowadays, even America may not be the exemplar it once was. I think Europe is probably not the exemplar it once was. If you look at how its belief systems are being co-opted, how its economy is relatively stagnant, which is kind of cool. I think countries like China, are providing these like very kind of like compelling alternatives, especially if you look as like a autocratic leader yourself, you might really see like this is a great model for me. You see increasing prosperity in Southeast Asia as well. I think that is also leading to kind of the apathy that you mentioned. And so I guess my question is just in this moment, like, who is your exemplar? Like, are you kind of like in a Japan moment where I think Japan, Taiwan, these kind of countries are trying to discover what is our own independent conception of liberal democracy with a less reliable United States? Or, are you still looking to the United States? Do you look to Europe or some other model? You mentioned communism earlier, so maybe like, like a communist type thing.
For me, I think we can find a lot of inspiration and model, not just for the present, but we can look at, the past example, like, maybe Jeff already mentioned something. It's like, Benjamin Lane, great abolitionist in 18th century in America. Yeah, he had to fought with not just about, people in the general that pro-slavery, but also Quaker community at that time that also pro-slavery. Yeah, so we can find something interesting. Or when I fought with the junta in Thailand, I always going back to what happening in China during Cultural Revolution. How people at that time, how intellectuals at that time can survive, not just physically, but mentally. And maybe this might be one perspective to look, to be resilient about what's happening with everything. Trying to see what in the worst situation, how people still can survive, how they still have some hope. Yeah, it might not be the best possible answer for, building liberal democracy. But I think we can, have spiritual resilience, and yeah, I think that's the most important.
And you've also convinced me of the value of being as globally eclectic as possible. Because when I was asking Natuit of places he'd like to, I mentioned I had gone to Vienna as part of the travels I did for my team. He said, I really want to go to Vienna. And there were all kinds of reasons you might say that. But his was because they have a very particular kind of fair housing policy. So it's this kind of the eclectic learning curve, which I think would be that's why I use the South Korea example. It's not that everything, and I've actually, when I mentioned that, one person said, oh, well, you don't know there are problems in South Korea. It's like, no, this is a specific thing that seemed to work,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so having maybe we're there's talking about, we're not in a unipolar world or a two-power world, but this sort of a global openness, eclecticism, which I think with I mean, I wish I could find an example with music that goes this way, but I think there have been moments of the past of
Mhm.
transmission.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But the transmission often ends up being, which I think is like music, it moves in different directions
Mhm.
because Gandhi
Mhm.
made the leap to being somebody, admired, but he was reading Thoreau.
Right.
And there is that kind of, and music can work that way as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly in the, in the Cold War era, there were very powerful sort of third world solidarity movements that included, musical solidarities, right? So you'd have these conferences between musicians from different countries, and they were kind of explicitly identified as being from those different countries, and they were all typically like, either communist or in many cases non-aligned, right? And those solidarities were very important. I mean, but I'm really kind of bowled over and excited about Netiwit's proposal, at least what I understand of it, which is that maybe we need not just solidarities across geographic borders, but solidarities like between the living and dead to some degree. Like perhaps we need to firm those up and figure out what that looks like. But I mean, I'm in for trying.
The end of, I still have to spend more time with Benjamin's book, but ghosts feature quite prominently. So I think the living and the dead have something to say. Well, I think we all can say this has been a fascinating hour and a half, and I want to thank our speakers, Jeffrey, Nick, Benjamin. Thank you very much.
And if people would be willing to walk down the hall to